Hundreds of billions of dollars are currently being deployed into AI, broadly speaking. Within this whole spectrum of things happening, markets like Africa, essentially in some ways already marginalized because we are not really controlling the source. We are not really controlling how this, shall I call it, manifestation of AI will be presented within an African context. If you're going to be globally competitive today, you have to be digitally transformed, or at least working to it in different ways. I'm traveling tomorrow, for instance, to Tanzania for a conference, and it's just down the road in Arusha. I said, let me just take the bus. And what was interesting is I paid for the ticket online, and the tickets that they gave me was still manually handwritten, as in it was a document and they filled in my details, wasn't computerized, nothing. And I'm like, in this day and age, this bus company, which is highly reputable, is still doing manual tickets. So we had a maid coming to our house some years ago, and she was going to stay in. And after she dropped her bags and everything, before even asking for a glass of water or anything, she just asked, what's the Wi-Fi password? And she didn't ask it in a manner that suggested it was something special or unique. It was asked with a very clear understanding that this is a basic requirement. One of the biggest things that we've seen that has made mobile technology so much more pervasive is the fact that we now have devices going for, I think, as little as 3,000 or 4,000 shillings, which you can buy from Safaricom. Number two, even at that price point, you have financing options, right? You can buy that phone at a rate of 100 shillings a day. And now that means that even people who are the lower part of the pyramid, who typically would not be able to afford such devices, can do so. I think probably the next layer of things that is going to get interesting is the arrival of AI. Imagine when that is something that is a utility on every mobile device. Imagine a person who's a farmer who can't communicate in standard English or Kiswahili and needs to use an AI to allow them to do certain things that require a competence in the language, which is no longer relevant because the AI is able to act as a proxy for them. That opens up so many opportunities.
Today's guest, founder and CEO of Dotsavvy, Moses Kemibaro. Welcome to the pod.
Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
Tell us about Dotsavvy. What do you do? Who is it for? And what's the main problem you're helping solve?
Well, Dotsavvy is, first of all, a fairly old company. I started it back in 2002 out of my essentially my single bedroom type of situation that I was living in at the time. And at the time that we set up the business, we were primarily focusing in those days on building and managing websites for a range of clients. And over the years, of course, 20 plus years later, the business has evolved significantly. We do everything from social media to content for our clients. We shoot videos. We've done commercials, digital advertising, and essentially, the big idea here is that we are trying to sort of provide what I tend to think of as high performance digital marketing that very much has an ROI component. So we're trying to make sure that there's impact, there's value delivered in terms of hard numbers for most of our clients. And we generally serve people in spaces like financial services. So we have insurance companies, we have banks, we have some nonprofits, we have some government business as well. And although we're a team of about 10 in total as a company, we generally cover a broad spectrum of client bases and industries. And the fact that we've been around now, I think for almost 22 years, suggests that hopefully we're doing something right.
Good stuff. One thing that you've mentioned is you've been in the game for over 20 years. So having been a digital pioneer for this long time, what has been the most significant change you've noticed in the digital space since you started out?
Well, so much has changed. I think initially it was almost treated like a novelty. It was almost a nice to have. People had a website. Many people didn't see it as a necessarily a commercial thing. They saw it as a necessary thing, almost like having a business card, so people could find you and see you online. But people didn't quite put significant value on it. So if you look about 20 years, 22 years ago, that's where the web was, right? And then secondly, the numbers weren't there. The number of Kenyans and people who are online were not there. We had not yet had the mobile and smartphone revolution, which transformed the adoption of digital technologies in this part of the world. So, in a nutshell, if you look at then and you juxtapose it with where we are today, where pretty much the most consumers in Kenya, I think I saw the report just the other day, I think Kenya has almost the highest prevalence of social media uptake globally in terms of the intensity with which we use social media. We had a massive transition with social in terms of adoption. We had the mobile revolution in terms of smartphones becoming common. Bandwidth became a much more accessible phenomena. The advent of 2G, 3G, 4G, and now 5G. When you converge all these developments together, essentially provided a platform that allowed digital uptake to really grow significantly, much, much more than it was back in the early 2000s. And today, really, for me, the biggest transition I would say is that, obviously, we have something like 25, 30 million people online in this country. Social media is where we spend all our time. Consumers have a bias for digital experiences, largely driven by, in recent times, because of the COVID pandemic. And yeah, we're using social not just for interaction and social connection, but we're using digital channels for everything from e-commerce to working from home. Our company today is fully remote. So we see a situation where essentially digital has become everything.
Right, right. You mentioned something which is the using of digital for commerce, for example. Um, Digital adoption has been a hot topic in sectors such as finance and retail. Right, we have neobanks now. We have niche e-com sites as well. How are you seeing technology impacting less obvious industries like, say, construction, for example?
Well, I think it's touching everything, in the sense that in every organization today that we see, especially again as a result of an accelerant like COVID, even industries or spaces that traditionally were not digital. I mean, let's just think of the humble WhatsApp. Yeah, how people, you just talked about an area like construction, for instance, how they're using WhatsApp, for instance, to take photos of a situation, sending it to the stakeholders and giving them daily updates on what's going online. You can't do that without digital. You need a smartphone. You need to be connected at a decent speed. You need a decent camera on that device. That's really transforming that. I see so many instances where we just take it for granted, but we see digital essentially permeating each and every space that we can imagine. If you think about legal, nowadays court cases are even done online. This is something that didn't exist before COVID. Manufacturing, people are running ERPs that are very affordable, like Zoho in the cloud, allowing them to do their financials across a distributed business in a very cost effective way. The fact that you have mobile apps that allow you to connect back to a central financial or operation system. Again, these are non-sexy industries, but without the internet, without these technologies, they basically cannot operate in the manner that is required.
You've mentioned COVID-19 as an accelerant. Looking back, how would you compare the state of digital transformation before and after COVID-19? And would you say that the pandemic was a necessary evil, a necessary nudge for African businesses to evolve digitally?
I think what it did is it created sort of the call to action, the urgency, the necessity to transition. And this is really coming from the perspective of that there were businesses and organizations that could not function without going through this transition, right? So for me, I feel like for a long time it was like a nice to have. Even when we were selling our products and services, clients would be somewhat, shall we say, reluctant in certain instances to put in good budgets, to experiment in certain areas that they felt were nice to have because everything was pretty much working well. With the advent of that particular moment, businesses and organizations had to change without any choice. Even churches started running services online because this is the only way they could
Yeah.
reach their congregants. And I think what it did is it opened the door to them realizing the opportunities that digital channels provide. And I'll give you an example. Many of our clients, we should spend a lot of time in traffic every week, going for meetings, stuck in traffic, going to areas like industrial area to meet a client
Yeah.
for 1 hour and then head back to the office, and you've lost 1 hour going, 1 hour coming back, 3 hours. That's half a day gone. The same clients are now the most diligent users of Zoom and Google Meet and Microsoft Teams. And in fact, when you do ask them that you want to meet them, they're like, well, do you want to do a social call or something? Doesn't have to be an official meeting, but for them, they're literally not interested in meeting physically anymore. For as long as they're our client and they know what we can do for them, they're happy. We have clients who we probably haven't met in 6 months, and we handle their work every day, and yet they're based in Nairobi, and so are we. So it changed the modus of business. If you told a client, circa 2019, let's do a Zoom call, they would look at you as if you're mad. They'll be like, what are you talking about? That's rude. That's unprofessional. Come to my office for a meeting. So we have seen also a change of behavior that's quite fascinating in terms of what's considered business proper or business normal. That wasn't the case before COVID.
Hmm. Now, adopting digital technologies has obvious advantages. A few of them you have already covered, but there's obvious barriers such as cost, infrastructure, and even the lack of skill set. Right? Um, how do you think African businesses should go about the push for this digital transformation, even with the barriers that I just mentioned?
I think we don't have a choice because if you're going to be globally competitive today, you have to be digitally transformed or at least working to it in different ways. And sometimes, it's not so much a question of just going online. There's also a question of reviewing your digital processes and seeing how you currently operate. Remember, digital transformation is not changing what you do, it's changing how you do it. And more importantly, leveraging technology to streamline business processes. You'll find, for instance, in many instances, many organizations, for instance, were running all their IT infrastructure on premise. Now, the very same organizations have invested and put things in the cloud. Number two, skilling, right? Or upskilling, making sure that your workforce and your teams are sort of technology competent to utilize some of these new technologies in ways that are important. But also looking at your business processes and asking yourself, how do we do this currently and could this be done digitally? And I'll give you a very simple example. When you go to many organizations today, they still have that book at the front where you sign in to confirm that you come for a meeting. Why is that not a tablet, or why is that not somebody keying in data into a system that then gives you
Yeah.
actionable data and also ensures, for instance, you're compliant with data privacy laws so that book doesn't get lost and people's contacts are available to the whole world? There's a lot of opportunity to sort of reassess and reimagine how your business processes are currently working and ask yourself, is there an opportunity for a digital intervention? Does this have to be manual? Does this have to be a human doing this? Could it be a software that's doing this instead? So there's a lot of areas of opportunity that I see where people have just gotten very comfortable, very complacent in how they run certain business processes, and yet there are technologies and solutions that could potentially close the gap, save costs, improve turnaround merely by applying an element of digital transformation.
I like that you gave a very practical example. You're about to go in for a meeting, you have to physically write your name, your ID number, your phone number, etc. Um, do you think that there's some sort of relationship between the low cost of labor in Africa and the lack of digital transformation? Do they overlap at all?
Yeah, I think there's something to be said about that because, in fact, quite often you'll find, even if you go into certain restaurants, you'll find 10 people hanging around and not doing that much. You go to Europe, you find two people or three people running a restaurant of that same size, and they're constantly moving and going back and forth, running the entire operation. So, what comes to mind very clearly to me is that sometimes the incentive to automate is not as high here because you know that maybe the labor cost of that individual is going to be 25,000 shillings a month. However, if you went to the UK, that same individual is probably earning something to the order of 200,000 shillings, because of their cost of
Yeah, yeah,
living, cost of labor, etc. So, in many instances, people still are doing things manually. I mean, I'm traveling tomorrow, for instance, to Tanzania for a conference, and it's just down the
yeah.
road in Arusha. So I took the flights. The flights are going to cost me about the same as going to Johannesburg, return. Didn't make sense. So I said, let me just take the bus. They have a bus that, goes that way every morning, the
Yeah.
small minivans. And what was interesting is I paid for the ticket online, which was through till number, but the ticket that they
Wait,
sent me
are
was a
those
picture.
are this the 14-seater Rosas?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. The buses to
Okay.
Arusha. The last time I did that,
Okay.
I think, was 20 years ago. But anyway, as it turns out, it's a most efficient way to travel for that kind of thing. And the tickets that they gave me were still manually handwritten, as in it was a document, and they filled in my details, wasn't computerized, nothing. And I'm like, in this day and age, this bus company, which is highly reputable, is still doing manual tickets. Chances are they've just gotten very comfortable with the process that's probably worked for the last 20, 30 years. But obviously, there's probably opportunities for fraud. There's opportunities for making mistakes. You wonder whether they have a computerized inventory system. How are they doing this in this day and age manually? So there's so much potential, I'm telling you, in this part of the world. But people are probably thinking, A, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Number two, labor is so cheap. It just means we can keep doing it this way because we don't have to computerize anyway.
I think there's another element that you didn't mention, and that is, I don't know if I should bracket it as corruption, but the status quo doesn't want change because there's avenues to eat here and there, as
There's
they say.
inherent incentives to maintain the status quo. Yes, that is
Exactly,
also another
exactly.
factor. Sometimes when you bring data into a situation, what it does, it creates insight. And with insight, you can start understanding loopholes, you can start understanding where you're losing revenue, you can start understanding opportunities to make more revenue. And quite often we've
Yeah,
seen reluctance in terms of certain organizational cultural changes because the incumbents don't want things to change. They're quite happy with the status quo. But the reality is that this potentially can actually be so significantly damaging if you don't have insight on certain things, meaning that your business could be going down the tubes and you literally don't know it's happening because you don't have information at your fingertips.
yeah, yeah. I want to talk about mobile technology. You touched on it earlier on, and it's been transformative in Africa so far, right? Everything from mobile money to mobile fast internet consumption. How
Yeah.
do you see this trend going on forward?
Well, if anything, it's going to just keep growing. I mean, one of the biggest things that we've seen that has made mobile technology so much more pervasive is the fact that we now have devices going for, I think, as little as 3 or 4 thousand shillings, which you can buy from Safaricom. Number two, even
Yeah.
at that price point, you have financing options, right? You can buy that phone at a rate of 100 shillings a day. Fine, it's a very
Mm,
basic smartphone, but what does it have? It has WhatsApp, it has TikTok, it has a few key softwares that we're all going to use anyway. And now that means that even the most, shall I say, people who are the lower part of the pyramid, who typically would not be able to afford such devices, can do so. The moment you have a connected device, it changes everything. Now, the truth of the matter is, data bundles, as they currently are very expensive. For the majority of Kenyans, it's not affordable, which is why everyone is always sort of running to some Wi-Fi network within the vicinity and getting connected. In fact, I'm reminded of an anecdote where we had a maid coming to our house some years ago, and she was going to stay in, and after she dropped her bags and everything, before even asking for a glass of water or anything, she just asked, what's the Wi-Fi password? And she didn't ask it in a manner that suggested it was something special or unique. It was asked with a very clear understanding that this is a basic requirement. Now, that is what has happened with mobile devices and technology. So the affordability of the devices has changed everything. Affordability or access to affordable either mobile networks or Wi-Fi networks is also a key driver because you need connectivity to get the utility. The proliferation of social media essentially acts as a medium through which you're able to have connection, do commerce, and all these things. But when you bring all these pieces together, it's only going to get bigger and it's only going to become more pervasive. I think probably the next layer of things that is going to get interesting is the arrival of AI, right? I think when you amplify people's capabilities using AI, which again we're seeing increasingly happening even here in Kenya. I currently, for instance, I'm using the latest Samsung Z Fold 6. It's got some incredible AI features built into it. It can do real time translation if you're having a conversation with somebody who speaks a different
wow.
language. It can do real time chat translation. It can create images on the fly. Incredible. But imagine when that is something that is a utility on every mobile device. Imagine a person who's a farmer who can't communicate in standard English or Kiswahili and needs to
Mm,
use an AI to allow them to, do certain things that require a competence in the language, which is no longer
yeah.
relevant because the AI is able to act as a proxy for them. That opens up so many opportunities. So I think it's only going to get bigger, but I see the role of AI being even more significant, especially for those underserved or maybe sometimes digitally illiterate people who are not
Yeah.
necessarily very competent in these areas, will certainly be empowered in ways that we can't imagine. And the smartphone or the mobile phone is the device that is going to make that possible.
You've touched on the potential implications of AI in Africa. Now, I don't know how you're looking at it, but from my uneducated perspective, or from my perspective of very little knowledge, it seems that a lot of the products that are coming from the West, the YC startups, etc., are consumer products, right? They're products that the
Mm.
African end user has no use for. And so, what are you seeing in AI other than the enterprise products that are, changing how we do things? What are you seeing in consumer that could be big for Africa?
Well, one of the areas that I can see a lot of things happening with AI is the within the African context. Actually, is there are organizations trying to develop their own uh, large language models with a local context, right? So that means, for instance, building an LLM that can be accessed in Kiswahili. building an LLM that uses inherently African content around things and topics that are locally relevant. I think there's a lot of potential, and I think we're just scratching the surface. Don't forget right now that in terms of investments, I think hundreds of billions of dollars are currently being deployed into AI, broadly speaking, in terms of different types of LLMs, companies building data centers. It's just a ridiculous gold rush that everyone is chasing. Is the return coming in yet? Not yet. But the reality is that within this whole spectrum of things happening, markets like Africa are essentially, in some ways, already marginalized because we are not really controlling the source. We are not really controlling how this, shall I call it, manifestation of AI will be presented within an African context. So increasingly, you're seeing a lot of concern, and a lot of organizations are starting to sort of see how can they build things that are locally relevant, either from things like what they call a low resource language, languages that potentially will disappear, putting them onto AI platforms so that we can access them there. Looking at solutions that leverage AI from an African perspective within all types of contexts. Think about scientific research. There's been research that finds, for instance, that the African genome is not adequately represented in terms of some of the medicines being created and things like this. So there's so
Mm.
many implications and so many opportunities around how you can deploy AI to sort of close some of those gaps within an African context. And it doesn't have to be just consumer facing applications, but everything from organizational level stuff, how government operates, and the list goes on and on and on.
I want us to shift and talk about a little bit about content. What I'm most curious about is your consistency over the years. You've been creating content for a while now. How are you avoiding burnout and maintaining a fresh perspective while staying consistent?
I think maybe the answer to that is curiosity. I just love, first of all, I love technology. So I write about technology. I write a lot about digital marketing, which is what I do as a practitioner. I write about digital media because you can also see media as a space is getting seriously disrupted. And those sort of seem to be the overlapping topics that I tend to cover. But I think what for me has kept me going all along is that I'm just incredibly passionate about the space. I love it. In some ways, I feel I don't even really work because what I do is what I love, the technology, the platforms, the content itself. I'm a gadget freak. So you'll see me doing everything from phone reviews to writing about AI, to writing about technology that I find really interesting and compelling. And a lot of what drives me or has driven me from the beginning of the content creation perspective is that I noticed in the early days of doing it, it was almost like journaling, where I'd be seeing things, I was watching, trends, I was watching what's happening, but you couldn't really find a lot of content online that spoke around the context of Kenya, the context of Africa. And I felt I had a need or a purpose or a calling almost to sort of close that gap and present unique perspectives around these topics from a sort of a wholesome Kenyan stroke African point of view. It was very frustrating to read, for instance, a newspaper, and then you'd see an article, but you could almost see that this was literally a cut and paste from, let's say, a big tech company pushing their own agenda.
Hmm.
How do we present impartial and incisive information around these areas that reflects the true story on the ground, but also in a balanced way? Okay, so that's where it started from. And trust me, over the years, what became happening is that the blog and what I've been doing is almost seen as a quasi newspaper or quasi resource that people come to get a sense of so what exactly is happening on the ground. So if I do an unboxing of a new Samsung phone, I'm going to do it from a Kenyan point of view. If I'm going to talk about internet access, I'll talk about it from a Kenyan standpoint or African standpoint. If I'm presenting statistics and perspectives around social media uptake in this region, I look at it through a lens that is relevant to us. And that for me gives me a lot of satisfaction because it is not a cut and paste of something happening in the UK or South Africa or North America. It brings it home in a relatively contextual manner. And for that reason, therefore, by carving out that niche, is why I managed to build out a fairly substantial following of people who know me for that kind of content. In terms of killing the burnout, I can't say that I don't get it. There are times that there's stuff that's sitting on the hard drive for weeks, sometimes months. I eventually publish it, but I kind of try and focus on what I tend to think of as the more top of mind stuff and something that I feel is genuinely unique that I need to write about, something that is interesting and compelling. And quite often, by the way, if I don't do it, no one else is going to do it. That's another thing. Literally, I find that you can be the one of one in a lot of content creation meaning that there's this
Yeah.
very weird possibility, unlike, say, New York or Silicon Valley, where there could be 100 bloggers talking about the same thing. You can literally be one of one around a lot of subject areas, meaning that potentially you could be the first resource on Google if anyone searches for it. So that is also
Hmm.
quite motivating, because there's so many possibilities around being that one of one. And I'll tell you right now, because I was one of the first people to write about Starlink in Africa, and more particularly in Kenya, and I think I've written probably 4 or 5 or even 6 articles about Starlink. People now call me and come to me, and the other day I was on a Zoom call with a Bloomberg reporter, talking to them about Starlink, because they're like,
Wow.
okay, we
Yeah.
want the Kenyan perspective, the African perspective. What's going on with Starlink? How did they find me? They googled probably Starlink Kenya. They found my articles and resources, and the next thing is they think of me as the expert on Starlink in Africa. And I'm going to take that hat if you give it to me. I don't mind, because why not? But in actual fact, in a way, I have become the guy to talk to about Starlink. So that's what I mean. You can be the one of one or the one of three, in a place where there's a dearth of content around these specific subject areas.
I want to revisit the very first question I asked you when we first met earlier this year. Knowing what you know today, if Moses Kemibaro was starting from scratch right now, what medium would you prioritize, and more importantly, why?
If I know what I know today and the places that I think I would focus on doing and mastering short form video content. Why? Because that is what the world is consuming. We see it on TikTok, we see it on Reels, we see it on YouTube Shorts. I think mastery of creating content in a very concise and easy to understand way opens you up to many audiences. I look at my young children, my son is a teenager, my daughter is a preteen, and I see how they consume video. I see how they interact with the internet. And it feels to me that that is now the vocabulary of communication for reaching younger people at scale. I also realize that platforms like these are now evolving to the point where the context of a search engine is now how that content is packaged within a video format. So if you're going to achieve reach, engagement, relevance, context, and all those nice things, I would say video done within a short form context is what I'd really want to prioritize right now if I was starting from scratch. Number two, in so doing, I'd also be trying to figure out how do I bring AI into the mix, meaning that things like post production, simplifying, making my work faster, easier, better. Using AI would also be a key component of that based on what I know today.
So we spent the last 4 years watching short form videos explode and TikTok becoming one of the most valuable companies in the world. Now there's talk of a potential resurgence of long form content as audience start craving more in depth personal content. Is this a trend that you've noticed?
Well, I've always been doing long form content. If you read some of my blog posts, those things are long. So in depth research and so forth. I think what is happening is that when people want a quick bite of a nugget of insight, a nugget of entertainment, a nugget of education, you go towards a short form, video of, anywhere from 15 seconds to maybe 3 minutes. However, when it comes to sort of what I call deeper, more cerebral type of content that requires in-depth understanding, richer insights, and so forth, you have no option but to consume long form content. So my view is always that content serves different purposes depending on the way it's packaged. All right. So if I do a podcast, typically my podcast will run for 1 minute, 1 hour, sorry. You'll find that in that conversation, the subject matter is deep and rich. Although at the same time, if you find me doing a basic unboxing of a phone, that typically runs somewhere between 5 to 10 minutes, right? So it depends on whether the content itself is fit for purpose. It also has a lot to do with the audience that's consuming that content. Is it more thought leadership content? Is it simply entertainment, stroke education content? There are all these variables that come into play depending on what that content is actually for, and who it's for. I think the who it's for is also critical. Who are you packaging this content for?
One of the things I've learned from observing you and how you work around your content is that you've truly mastered the art of repurposing, right? So could you walk us through your process of taking a single piece of content and giving it new life?
Wow. Okay. So let's just say, let's talk about a podcast, for instance, right? I do a lot of podcasts. I probably crank out about one a week on average. I before even I start, if I have a guest I'm going to invite, I will figure out who it is, why I'm bringing them into this conversation. Sometimes it's a paid conversation. Sometimes it's me reaching out to somebody and saying, I want to talk to you. I think you have something interesting to share. So, case in point would be the other day I did one with Brian Longwe. Brian Longwe is a legend of the technology space in East Africa and Africa in general, one of the pioneers of the internet, in particular as a CTO who set up a number of ISPs. He has a really compelling story. So I reached out to him literally at a conference, grabbed him into a room, and we didn't really have a script. We didn't have a session plan. Normally, if I do a podcast, I do something called a session plan, which is my questions and all this, which I prepare and I give to the guest beforehand to prepare, and we go through all these questions about them. And as I do that content, usually I already have a specific objective in mind. Like I want to surface certain insights. So it's going to run anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour. Once that is done, I will obviously publish the video with its opening and ending. I'll also repurpose that content into audio, so it goes onto the Spotify's and Apple Podcasts, but also do like a synopsis of the conversation. And that is where you find a blog post will emerge out of that. And what's interesting about it is that I do all these pieces of content because what I've learned over time is that there are people who know me as a blogger. There are people who now know me as a YouTuber because of the podcast that I put on YouTube. There are people who also know me as a social media person who publishes on Twitter. I'll take the same content to Twitter in a short form. I'll also do snippets of that content that go into the shorts and stuff. And here's the crazy thing, I'll do a newsletter as well. Out of the blog post I create that gives a summary of that conversation from the podcast, and then I'll embed the videos into there as well as the audio. What have I learned? People consume content in different contexts and in different audiences. Meaning, the people I reach on my blog, usually I'm quite aware that these are people who've known me as being a blogger probably for the better part of 15 years, 10 years. There are people who know me as a YouTuber. When someone says I saw you on YouTube, I'm almost like, I know you're pretty new. When somebody says to me they get the newsletter, I kind of know you're probably a LinkedIn person. So it's kind of like, I call it atomization. You want to atomize your content so that wherever that audience is, you meet them where they are. You want to be relevant. Even now, I'm experimenting with posting long form content on TikTok because TikTok now gives you
Hmm.
up to an entire hour. And I did a couple of YouTube videos recently, and I've published them now on TikTok full form, and I'm trying to see how that works there. But basically, the key insight is people consume content in different ways at different times for different reasons. There are times when I will know that I want to listen to this podcast, and I'll go to maybe see a YouTube video, and then I'll try and look and see if they have a podcast of that video because I know I'm not going to sit down for 2 hours. But when I'm stuck in traffic, I can listen to it on my Spotify. So I try and kind of be everywhere for everyone in every way because it gives me more reach, gives me more engagement, and it gives me more audiences.
One of my favorite frameworks on content is by Shanpuri, the co-host of My First Million. He talks about the premise of building a binge bank, which is basically convincing yourself that the lower view count early on doesn't matter as much because you're focused on building a library of who you are. So when people do discover you and are interested, they can follow a breadcrumb of content. What has worked for you, and how did you stay motivated early on?
I think, to be honest with you, there was a part of me that initially started off again out of almost frustration. Like I'd see stuff all over the place that just didn't tell the story accurately or fully. And then I felt I could be the person who does that, right? So I'd go in and say, okay, this is something that Nation published. But then I would possibly cite the link and then give my interpretation of what's really going on the ground or expanding on that particular article. Over time, it also became an opportunity for celebrity. And I'll tell you why. I started writing content literally like a journal. And as I started doing this more frequently, I'd get acknowledgement, I'd get feedback, I'd get people reaching out and saying, hey, I saw this. Then I started getting invited to conferences. Then I was getting flown out of the country to places to participate, to attend. And then I started getting free smartphones every other week, to review. And you then start realizing that as you're building your personal brand in this space, it would also give currency to what I was doing in my career. But as I started, but I started building up my career. I realized the blogging and the content creation became almost a marketing funnel, because then I would get clients and business and gigs as a result of creating content. So the motivations have sort of evolved over time. Yes, there is some value in still being, we have a saying in blogging, we say being first is everything. And that's meaning that, it's like breaking the story, sharing the insight. Being first can be everything, because people then start to think of you as a source. But basically, the currency of awareness is so powerful. The idea that you can be at the center of attention around important topics by virtue of creating that content is incredibly motivating. And more importantly, sometimes when I've seen the number of doors and the kinds of doors it opens, it's just incredible. It's completely worth it. So I think of it as a good investment. I think of it as good practice, and sometimes incredibly rewarding and motivating at the same time.
I'm curious how you kept going very early on when the numbers were not as you expected, right? So what kept you creating? What kept you publishing? What kept you, putting out content?
For me, it's like an itch I needed to scratch, right? Many people have dropped off over the years, and I think they started off with the notion of, this is a money making exercise, this is something to do for the cash. In fact, very early in the days, I remember, I think it was about 2014, I did a blog, I did a presentation at something called the word camp is the event for WordPress bloggers.
WordPress? Yeah.
And we had it here, in Kenya. In fact, there's one coming up in a couple of months. And I had a phrase I used. I said, blog what you love what you blog. And why I was saying that is because even when I first started blogging, I'd write about Formula One, I'd write about technology, the things I was passionate about, the things I loved. And then, over time, I refined it and realized that I had to stick with a sort of a common theme, which became kind of like marketing, media, and technology. Kind of those three things became my focus areas. But in actual fact, it's stuff that I'm already sort of into, it's stuff that I love. I don't do it for the money. The money is almost like an added bonus. But it's so enjoyable in terms of being able to be the guy who talks about the stuff that matters, and building your social currency and your professional currency around that stuff. But more importantly, it sort of positions you or repositions you in a way that people actually look up towards you and want to work with you, want to engage with you. And you keep going because, as I said, it's almost like by giving with no expectation, you actually start to get stuff back. Right? You're putting it out, you have no expectations, you're not saying this is going to make me money, but a phone call comes through, and suddenly you're sitting in the middle of a million shilling gig because of content you created online. That for me is just incredibly was very surprising in the earlier days, but now I come to expect it because of that.
Now you know better than anyone else that people connect with people, not brands. On that note, how should founders think about prioritizing between building a personal brand versus building the company brand identity?
I think nowadays there's an expectation for the founder to become a personal brand. Why? Because we see it in the world where, for instance, Mark Zuckerberg will be forever affiliated with Meta. The list goes on and on. Founders have become, I mean, look at the way Elon Musk uses his personal brand to drive the agenda for Starlink and all the businesses that he runs, including Tesla. In fact, if I'm not wrong, Tesla doesn't have a marketing budget. The vehicles are purely sold word of mouth and through these digital platforms. The other day, I was even checking because I was writing something about, I think it was Starlink, and they don't even have, I think, a LinkedIn profile. It's insane. But what is it? They've managed to use the personal brands to such an effective rate that the corporate brands rely on their personal brands to sustain themselves. And I think it's almost like a two for one, right? If you can build your personal brand and concurrently build your corporate brand, then that's a win-win in both sides. But increasingly, people attend to the personal brand and then use the personal brand as the entry point into the corporate brand. That's what I'm seeing happening in the marketplace. And I think there's never been a time in history when building a strong digital personal brand, a brand that is active on social platforms, putting out thought leadership on LinkedIn, creating interesting short videos on YouTube and so forth, where you start to use the personal brand to serve the agenda of the corporate brand as well. I think they can work as almost two sides of the same coin.
Content monetization in Africa can be challenging, especially in entertainment. How should African creators think about monetizing their arts?
It's a tricky one, right? And if I was just to use my own example, I mean, I create a lot of content online, but it gets monetized offline, meaning because of what I put online, people reach out to me to moderate a session at a conference, which is paid work. People call me to be a speaker at an event, paid work. People come and say, hey, I noticed you said you do digital marketing. Can you come talk to us at our company to see how you can do our digital marketing, which then becomes an engagement. One of the things I also do a lot of is I do a lot of digital training. I train people on how to use digital marketing. That opens up doors like you wouldn't believe. But the reality is that monetization in Africa, in the sort of classical US or European model, where you might have affiliate marketing, where you might have some kind of online publisher platform that allows you to build a community where people pay subscriptions, don't work very well in Africa. In fact, if you look at the media space, we can already see that consumers are saying that they're not going to pay for online subscriptions for news. And that is why you
Yeah.
see many of the mainstream publications are struggling, because some of the newer upstart media brands don't charge you to consume content. They monetize through ads online, and also fairly, shall I call them, human resource light. They can afford their cost versus a legacy media house. So I think in many instances, what I tend to tell people within the African context, if you're going to monetize your content here, figure out how you can take people from online to offline. That's what tends to be the most successful way to monetize. Figuring out how to create products and services that use your content sort of as the sort of the top of the funnel, but the conversions more often than not happen in a more non-digital manner. Today, if I'm doing an engagement with an ad agency, um, like right now, I have one for one of the internet service providers. I'll be doing a review of their service and talking about their products. Um, I'm going to create the content online, but it's monetized offline. Yeah, so that's kind of like how what seems to work in these markets.
To kind of look at it another way, or to rephrase what you just said, you're kind of shifting the monetization from the consumer to the business, right? To enterprise. Is that kind of how you're looking
Yeah,
at things?
yeah. For me, I tend to do what I call a B2B monetization. So I'm not looking at. I have opportunities. Like if I, for instance, just being hypothetical here, if I was able to package my training into something that's sellable. So put it on something like Teachable, or one of these platforms, put it online. But then I would probably have to package it as a global product as opposed to just being one targeting an African or Kenyan market.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I could find a way to use systems or platforms like Paid. I know Paid is one of them in Kenya, where maybe I do a localized type of training and maybe I can monetize with people paying via M-Pesa, for instance. So that opportunity does exist. But I find that given that I have very limited bandwidth, I'm still running an agency, I'm doing content creation as an individual, I don't have the currently the bandwidth or the focus to kind of build that sort of structured approach. But is it an opening? Is it a possibility, a more B2C type of a model? Absolutely. The only thing I haven't quite figured out is it, significantly scalable? Is it practical? Is it cost effective? Those are things that I would need to answer for myself if I actually go that route. But as things stand, as more of a thought leader, as more of what we call a key opinion leader, and monetizing content in that manner, for me works best in sort of a more B2B model.
Interesting, interesting. Speaking of bandwidth, I'm curious what a week in your life looks like. How do you juggle creating content, writing, showing up for podcasts, running your agency? How does that all fit into 24 hours?
Well, one thing that helps a lot is the fact that I work predominantly remotely, right? So I don't have the regimen of having to get into traffic and running to the office and coming out. So it gives me a lot of flexibility in terms of mobility and where I can be and what I can do. Because for me, work is not a place I go to. Work is a thing I do. Right. If I need to go to the studio, chances are I'll probably show up at the studio 2 hours before. I'll work on the sidelines on my day job stuff. And then I'll switch into studio time to do my content. Then I'll switch back into my day job stuff, and then I'll go pick up the kids from school. I'll come back home. I'll work again in the house, and I kind of weave and in and out of the work. But of course, I have a responsibility. I have a company with 10 people. So I have to also make sure that I prioritize or schedule my time accordingly each day around those priorities. And that means sometimes having to make the call of, man, I'd really want to be at this conference. I'd really like to be this forum. But guess what? My time is constrained. I must focus on the most vital, most important things at that moment in time. And sometimes this means, making calls like choosing not to take certain pieces of business because I won't have the bandwidth to deliver, competently and meet the requirements of my clients. It means making decisions around what is most critical for the business at that point in time, but also as I'm doing my content, which is also in itself a kind of a business, being able to find what I'd call an acceptable balance between the two.
Moses, this has been an amazing conversation. It's been exciting to see Africa's potential through your perspective. One last question. Where can listeners find you online if they want to learn more or reach out?
Well, there are quite a few places. If you Google me as Moses Kemibaro, you'll probably find most of my platforms. You can also go to moseskemibaro.com. That sort of is my blog where pretty much all my information is. And increasingly, I'm spending a lot of time building up my YouTube channel. So if you just search for Kemibaro, you'll find me also on YouTube. And of course, the same would apply to places like Spotify and so forth. So literally, because I'm so online, very online, as they say, moseskemibaro.com would, be probably the best place to start.
All right.